All right, let's get into this now. Section27 has launched its latest report on climate change as a human rights risk, a resource for health and education rights activists in South Africa. The Youth Month report explores the link between climate change and children's rights, focusing on healthcare, education, gender equality and budget justice. Candidate attorney at Section27, Motheo Brodie, joins us for a discussion. Thank you so much for your time. Just give us a sense and tell us more about this report. I'm particularly interested in the correlation and the link between, climate change and, of course, children's rights. Perhaps let's start with healthcare and education.
Sure. Thank you for having us. Sure. And today we released this report, Climate Change as a Human Rights Risk, a resource for activists. And really, I think as some may know, Section 27 works mainly on the right to basic education and the right to access to healthcare services. But I think it is short-sighted to work on those issues without taking into account the threat that climate change poses. And so we have increasingly begun to do that work, and this report is another milestone in doing that work. When we look at, particularly, perhaps we can start with education, right? When we look at the basic education system, it is quite vulnerable to climate change. The 2022 floods in KZN, I think, were a great example of how vulnerable the system is to climate change, where we had over 600 schools that were damaged with quite large financial costs to our fiscus. So, there's a link, both direct in terms of damage to infrastructure, learners not being able to go to school, but then there are other indirect links. But perhaps to even stay on the direct links, when we look at heat and what that does to learning, there's studies that have shown that learners perform much worse when they learn in environments which are hot and warm. And when you look at learners who are learning in cooler temperatures, they perform much better. And so these are some of the things that we need to start dealing with. And this report really highlights what the impacts are on vulnerable groups like children, both in terms of education and health, and other vulnerable groups like women, migrants, who are particularly vulnerable to the threat that climate change poses.
And I want us to touch on, the current state of children's rights. I mean, as the climate change intensifies, children who are a vulnerable group in the sense, and young people, they become more vulnerable to its effects. I mean, how important then is it that they also sit around the table and inform policy?
It's crucially important that children are around the table. In fact, one of the things that we look at in this report, we look at what the state's obligations are, both from an international law perspective, but also at a domestic law perspective. But from an international law perspective, we've got a general comment number 26 from the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which highlights and explains or sets out what the state's obligations are. So, for example, General Comment number 26 speaks about states needing to take a child rights approach to climate change. So, considering how children are impacted by climate change in the development of policy and implementation of policy and laws. But crucial to that is that you have children around the table. And I think even in South Africa, we know that children are quite mobilized. Youth particularly also are quite mobilized and are quite knowledgeable on the impact of climate change on their lives and on their futures.
I mean, in South Africa, and if we have to zone it in and we look at the just transition in itself, I mean, what are you finding there in as far as the risks where women and children particularly, as we start to talk about gender equality, are at risk? Because, I mean, we know, of course, of the benefits, but have we done enough in terms of just investigating what this will all mean, you know, for particularly women and children?
Sure. So that's one of the things that we highlight in this report. So, for example, when we speak about the Just Energy Transition Partnership and the investment plan, you find that those groups, those vulnerable groups, women, children, are often peripheral to the conversation, right? And there's a need to center those that are being made peripheral to this conversation. So in terms of budgeting, we need to see gender-sensitive budgeting. We need to see child rights impact assessments that are done whenever we're considering this just energy transition, whenever we are taking decisions that are having an impact on the environment and climate change.
And the stakeholders that you work with, you know, when you do undertake these reports, I mean, just give us a sense in terms of what happens now that, you know, the climate change as a human rights risk is done. You know, what are the next steps?
Sure. So from our side, we are continuing to work with partner organizations, both from an education rights perspective and health rights perspective, on this, collaborating on climate change and climate justice, and really thinking through what the impact is and what policy change we need. And that's one thing that we're doing. But two, also taking this report to the decision makers, taking this report to the Department of Basic Education, where we've highlighted what the vulnerabilities of the education system are, taking to the Department of Health, where we've highlighted what the vulnerabilities of the health system are. But continuing to work on this, I think the climate change bill that has been passed both at a National Assembly and COP level and is awaiting signature from the President, if I'm not mistaken, provides a great opportunity for civil society to input into the state's adaptation plans, because once that's signed into law, the state then has to do a vulnerability assessment and develop adaptation plans. And we're looking to start that conversation and to get people around the table talking about those issues.